So let's talk about the strategic limitations of every faction in 40k and how best to lay them low. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. In today's video, I'm going to finally get around to one that I've been requested quite a few times on the channel, and to talk through every faction and army in Warhammer 40k, and talk about their main weaknesses on the table. Often it's really quite easy to understand the problems that your army is facing, but perhaps not realise that the challenges that the opponent's facing, and what actions or choices you might make with your own army to give them a few more challenges in-game. I thought perhaps the best way to approach this would be to talk through some of the limitations and capabilities of each army in 40k, as well as perhaps some of the best ways of damage dealing against them, common weapon profiles that are usually going to be fairly effective against the majority of the opponent's army. We might throw in a few more thoughts about certain missions and matchups, though obviously in reality just about every army is slightly different. You can have different sub-factions within the same codex, or lists built around vastly different units, so a fair bit of this might be a little bit on the broad brush side. In any case though, let's jump straight into it. We'll start out with the Imperium, then move through in turn to Xenos and Chaos. So starting out with the power armoured folks, let's talk Space Marines. Currently I'd rate them around about a medium strength faction in Warhammer 40k, very strong at the start of the edition, but having faced a lot of codex creep from all the other 9th dexes. Space Marines have such a crazy unit pool that lists could look very different depending on what chapter you're facing or what playstyle they're going down. Aside from hordes of models, they can basically put just about any flavour of army on the table, so it's a bit difficult to talk about them in general terms. I'd say perhaps in army capabilities, Marines do suffer a bit from being jack of all trades, master of none. It means that they're really quite easy to use, but basically just about every unit will be paying for multiple different capabilities. Even the most basic troopers have a little bit of melee threat and have reasonably tough power armour to chew through, and it just means that a few of their specialised units aren't really quite as hard-hitting as they might be otherwise, as you're paying for that decent defence and some melee. Marine lists in general also tend to be relatively elite. It's definitely not the worst thing in 9th edition, but it does bring a few problems. You're not going to have as many expendable units to have on the front lines, screening things like deep strike or move blocking isn't going to be as easy, and sometimes more hoardy lists can overwhelm elite armies just because they don't have enough shots to deal with them. In general, if you know you're going to be fighting a whole bunch of Space Marines, then generally high AP multi-damage weapons will be the best. Usually damage 2 or damage 3 weapons work great. The flat damage will remove things like standard Space Marines, Terminators or Blade Guard veterans really quite easily, and high AP is almost always going to have decent value into power armor. Spamming things like plasma weapons or anything else that's damage 2 with a high rate of fire is usually going to be a good job, plus a little bit of anti-tank for dreadnoughts and things that reduce damage by 1, and any weapons that reroll wound rolls can be quite good. Transhuman physiology is often in play in Force and Space Marine lists, so lightning claws can be a good way to fox that, and a lot of things that give you better wound rolls such as Blood Angels +1 to wound or some Drukhari poison weapons just aren't going to be quite as efficient, as there's a good chance you might just be wounding on 4s anyway if they use that stratagem on key units. Of course, Space Marines aren't just really one book, but have a whole ton of crazy sub-factions to draw from as well. In general, I'd see most of these books as more sort of bringing additional benefits to the Space Marine army. In terms of weaknesses, maybe it's a bit more of an issue of what the sub-faction books don't bring to their chapter, and also maybe incentivizing certain builds that will have some strengths and weaknesses. Just to run through very quickly, Ultramarines maybe don't get as much melee or speed buffs, and don't tend to go in for melee characters quite as much as some of the rest, but do have good tactical flexibility, redeployment and better bolters. White Scars are very much all about the speed and melee on the other hand, but don't get as much buffs to their ranged fire. They also really want to be doing the charging, not being charged to activate their assault doctrine, so can be a bit liable to counter charges. Iron Hands I think in general really are quite strong all-rounders for Space Marines. They perhaps do tend to have a bit of a vehicle heavy slant and more focus on range than melee, though with successor chapters you can do both. Raven Guard are currently one of the weakest Space Marine chapters, having some fun deployment and pre-game move shenanigans, but not quite as many damage boosts or raw power as some of the rest. Ignore's cover is going to be really quite good against their chapter tactic as well. Salamanders bring a fair amount of raw power, particularly with their Melter and Flamer weapons, but they often incentivize you to build lists that are fairly slow and short-ranged. It does mean that you might be able to outmaneuver them or gun them down from a distance. Imperial Fists are just generally quite weak at the moment. A lot of their damage is really quite bolter-centric, and out of that they can underwhelm a bit. They've got very little synergy for melee, and just a lot of their tables of traits and psychic powers and things within their codex just aren't really quite as good as their peers. For the more divergent chapters, Blood Angels will be hitting very hard in melee, but don't have all that many shooting synergies. -1 damage units can be really powerful against their sanguinary guard, and rules like transhuman physiology to only wound on 4+ really quite hurt them, as their chapter tactic buffs their wound roll. Space Wolves are really quite decent when they're in combat, with lots of access to buffs and synergies. Maybe their biggest issue is delivering them into melee. They also have a couple of other limitations like less apothecaries, and not all that many synergies with shooting units. Dark Angels and their strongest builds I feel are often quite railroaded into taking those Ravenwing or Deathwing detachments. They can slightly hinder the other units that you might want to take, things maybe like Infiltrators, Incursors, and a bunch of the more normal firepower units. Certainly quite a solid chapter in general, but each of the builds does have its own weaknesses. Deathwing are mighty but really quite slow. Ravenwing are fast and hard hitting, but will get chewed up really quite easily by high strength damage 2 or 3 weapons. Black Templars again are really quite solid right now. I guess they don't get Psychers, but they do make up for it by having more Chaplain litanies. A lot of the time they'll be taking that 5+ invul save vow, which usually means that they're going to be getting little to no cover benefits, and again they tend to be at least relatively slow and fewer shooting synergies than other chapters. Finally, Deathwatch have some restricted units, and in general don't make quite as good use of quite a lot of the codex. A lot of their strength just tends to be in a few niche builds for their kill teams and dreadnought castles, and quite a lot of their actual special kit and their unique flyer just aren't really all that strong. Obviously all of these guys do bring their strengths to the table as well, but I think it is kind of good that most of the chapters do have their benefits and downsides. I think on the whole Games Workshop has done quite well to make a lot of them desirable to take. Moving on to the rest of the Imperium, and just in general the Astra Militarum or Imperial Guard are relatively weak in power, definitely waiting for their 9th edition codex, and in general a lot of armies shouldn't have too much difficulty overcoming them if they do take a strong build and play it well. In terms of what they can do in their army, they can pack some fairly devastating shooting out of things like Demolisher tank commanders, but across the rest of their army they've got some big gaps in their roster. Their melee power is really limited, with only a few key units able to do anything of note. Ballistic skill at 4+ is really quite vulnerable to enemy modifiers or dense cover, and they don't have a lot of options for being able to fall back and shoot, so even touching some of their shooty battle tanks in melee can make them completely useless for a turn. If you're playing against Guard, in general you're going to want to have something that's going to deal with hordes of infantry, and something that's going to deal with tanks. Mass strength for bolter fire, maybe with a little bit of AP, is usually going to have a lot of effect against the infantry, maybe some strength 6 so you're wounding on 2s, and then for dealing with things like Lehman Russes, you want things that are strength 8 or 9, high damage, and high AP to get around that 2+ armor. The high AP really will have good effect on the Guard vehicles, they don't really generally have any invul saves. For missions and things, the Guard also can have some trouble with secondaries. You're often quite incentivized to run really quite a lot of minor support characters, which can be quite bad for assassinates, and if you either go vehicle or infantry heavy, you could be exposing yourself to the secondaries that involve either killing tanks or killing hordes of models. Next up we have the Adeptus Custodes, certainly one of the stronger factions in Warhammer 40k at the moment. They've been doing pretty well in tournaments over the past couple of months. I certainly wouldn't be too surprised to see some balance changes at the next balance pass. A fair few of their units are just a touch on the undercosted side. In general though, Custodes do tend to play things in their own way. They really are a hyper-elite army, they're likely to be vastly outnumbered by their opponent most of the time. They're not going to be very good with screening, and if you are able to take out some outlying units, they might struggle to reinforce certain sections of the board. Only a few of their units move quite fast. They also tend to be fairly close combat orientated. A few of their Forge World support pieces can do some decent ranged fire, and the Virtus Praetors will certainly fire off a big volley of anti-tank, but they don't have an absolute ton of long range things and don't really have access to barrage weapons either. In general, if you want to try and bring down Custodes, generally anti-tank weapons are what you need to fire at them. If you basically just treat them as little walking battle tanks, then you're not going to be going too far wrong. In particular, just throwing loads of damage 3 weapons at them is fairly reasonable. That's going to have some seriously good effect into just the standard Custodes and also the Virtus Praetor bags. Just in terms of recent tournament results, it does appear that Adeptus Custodes do tend to be quite weak to the new Harlequins, perhaps struggling to bring their enormous weight to bear on the fast, mobile and hard-hitting Eldar. The Adeptus Mechanicus are described as a fairly mid-tier army at the moment, toned down from their incredibly powerful first codex drop, though still have some really interesting synergies. Seeing as basically most of their codex went up by a few points, a lot of their units just aren't really all that powerful at base anymore, and basically need to make maximal use of their unit synergies, things like character buffs, Doctrina Imperatives, or Canticles of the Omnissiah, if they do actually want to be fairly powerful in terms of damage dealing. I'd also bear in mind that Doctriners can often hinder elements of their army as well as help. Bulwark will slow down a bunch of forces, and Protector will hurt their melee even if it makes them shoot better. And there are a few things that they just don't really do within their codex. They don't really have much psychic defense to speak of, and they don't really do combat characters either, generally tending to be more buffing pieces. If playing AdMech, I'd say probably the sweet spot of weapons would tend to be around about strength 6 or 7 guns. Most of their units tend to vary in toughness between 3 and 6, so these are almost guaranteed to have a decent impact, and having a bit of high AP shooting on the go could be quite handy as well for getting around Bulwark Doctrine, or that annoying ability for one unit to ignore AP-1 or AP-2 attacks. Next up, for the Sisters of Battle, I'd say they're more of a medium strength army now, fairly decently strong when their codex released, but they have been toned down a fair bit in chapter approved, and in combination with a bunch of powerful books releasing, they're not looking quite as mighty as they were maybe. In general, the Sisters tend to do quite a lot of their damage at fairly close range with things like flamers, melters, or rapid firing bolters, so if you can try and shoot and destroy them from a fair way away, that's usually going to be quite effective. Most of their best damage dealers often tend to be really quite elite infantry units as well. Things like Retributors and Dominions are really quite fragile when they're exposed, and if they fail to deal big damage on their alpha strikes, they're generally going to trade out fairly badly. I'd also say that they have a fair few fewer anvil units capable of taking a good punch. I guess Sisters in cover can be relatively hard to shift, but toughness 3 means they're going to be taking a whole load of saves. In general, if you're expecting to see a fair few Sisters units about, I think that something in the range of strength 4 to 6 weapons with decent AP will usually do well. Particularly high rate of fire damage 1 weapons will really clear out their elite infantry quite quickly. Combine that with a little bit of quality anti-tank to bust things like rhinos and immolators, and you should be able to handle a fair bit of the codex. Next up we have the Grey Knights, who I'd rate somewhere medium to strong. Certainly a powerhouse army when their codex came out, though they were toned down a bit in chapter approved, things like multiple brotherhoods going away, Dread Knights getting a points increase, as with Interceptors. Still good, though not probably cutting edge top tier of the meta. For their own damage dealing, they do tend to be at least fairly short ranged and quite elite. The vast majority of their weapons are generally going to be most effective at 24-inch range or less, and they're often going to get quite a lot closer than that if they want to put their decent melee and psychic powers to good use, so perhaps can be forced to come to you at least somewhat. When they're on the board, a few of their units just aren't really all that fast, like Stripe Marines. They might be somewhat dependent on teleport tricks like Command Points or Gate of Infinity for movement around the board, and they do face a couple of unique challenges for their army, being Psychers. So if you've got an army that's really quite good at denying the witch quite a lot, they're really not going to thank you for that, or things with decent shrug-off abilities against mortal wounds like Feel No Pain. They'll give up Abhor the Witch really quite easily as a secondary objective. Against the majority of Grey Knights list, that's almost an auto-include secondary. You're likely to get a fair amount of points for it just by playing the game and doing what you would do anyway. And if you want to bring down Grey Knights, maybe the optimal profile might be something like Strength 6, AP-2 and damage of 2, and spam those shots. It'll be great against Stripe Marines and Interceptors, and Dread Knights are only toughness 6 and don't reduce damage characteristics, so there's a fair bit of shooting that's just going to be almost equally effective against Dread Knights as it is against the foot troops. Bear in mind that one Grandmaster Dread Knight is quite likely to have that sigil of exigence, so when you shoot that it might try and teleport away somewhere. Sometimes it could be worth triggering that early so they don't get to do it later in the game, or otherwise if you think you might be able to assault it and kill it, just don't shoot it at all and deal with it in combat. Next up we have the Imperial Knights, certainly vastly improved with their objective taking buffs lately, but I'd still say they're an army that's slightly on the weaker side and awaiting their new codex with bated breath. Knights and Chaos Knights are perhaps one of the most weird and out there factions in 40k, an army comprising an entirety of vehicles, a lot of them super heavies, and kind of take a lot of the advantages and disadvantages of being a skew list to extremes. They're going to be ridiculously elite as they don't field infantry, so some issues around screening and objectives. If you lose a knight, then you might not be able to get to that point on the battlefield for quite a while. A lot of their weapons might struggle a little bit against massed infantry. Many of the big knights tend to have fairly quite quality fire, but not all that much quantity. Big units like super heavies are often really quite susceptible to debuffs as well. For example, being hit by Doom and Jinx on a super heavy walker means that an Eldar player could just get massively easy shooting into it and potentially take it down spectacularly easily. For missions and terrain, of course heavy terrain tends to be a knight player's worst enemy. Super heavies can be shot over obscuring terrain but won't be able to shoot back, so you might be in the situation where important enemy units can shoot your knights but you can't hit them, and just because they're all vehicles, manoeuvring around those bits of terrain can be a bit of a challenge. Many secondary objectives also don't work particularly well for them. You've only got a very limited pool of ones that you'd realistically pick as a Knights player. Hopefully something that might well be rectified when they do get their new codex. In terms of weapons to kill them, it almost goes without saying that if you run into a list that's just packing excessive anti-tank firepower, it's going to be a really bad time for Imperial Knights. Hopefully most balanced lists will only be taking a certain amount of anti-tank and have a fair bit of anti-infantry that won't be all that effective. But even things like mass damage 2 attacks can actually be surprisingly effective against Knights, seeing as they don't have the -1 damage that things like Dreadnoughts do. They certainly put a fair amount of raw power on the table and might on objectives, but being such a weird skewed faction, they perhaps are one of the armies that have some of the most obvious weaknesses out of any. Moving into Chaos now, and we'll start with the Chaos Space Marines, perhaps one of the armies in the game that most desperately needs its new codex. Very weak on the board right now. Hopefully they don't have too much longer to wait. Perhaps their main issues at the moment is they have fairly expensive 1-wound infantry that aren't really that hard to take down for the cost, and most datasheets in the book just really aren't all that good for the points that you pay for them. If you want to have good damage output, you're generally going to need to make use of multiple stacked Chaos Synergies, things like stratagems layered with psychic powers and character auras, just to get to the point where they're going to do quite good damage. They do have really quite a wide pool of units to draw on, but they do tend to be a little bit more melee focused without as many good ranged options within the book, and maybe have to rely a bit on Forge World units if they want to have some good fire support, things like Contemptors perhaps. Chaos Space Marines do tend to have a bit more of a varied amount of targets they might bring to the table, anything from cultists to standard marines or demon engines with invul saves. I think for the most part, most weapons aren't going to struggle too much taking down most of their units. As they are predominantly a Space Marine faction though, getting high AP weapons on the board to deal with that power armor is usually going to be a good idea. Probably a bit more of an emphasis on damage 1 weapons until they do get their fabled second wound. Next up we come to the Chaos Demons, again one of the weaker armies that are waiting for their 9th edition book. Though perhaps have a few stronger builds than the Chaos Marines, things like Mass Keepers of Secrets, Be'lakor, and a few other choice units. Still though, really quite a lot of the codex does remain kind of underwhelming. Army-wise, again they do work quite differently to quite a lot of the other factions in 40k. They really rely on invul saves for their defense, so usually large volumes of low AP fire is going to be the best way to hoover them off the table. They're also really quite melee-centric compared with virtually any of the other 40k factions. There's really very limited ranged options within the codex, and most of them are a touch underwhelming. So most of their units are going to try and need to reach the enemy, and likely brave a gauntlet of guns while getting there. A fair bit of their damage does often tend to be a bit on the lower strength side as well, so they might struggle to kill knights and other armies full of big heavy hitters. And missions and matchup wise, having invul saves as their main form of defense does mean that they're not going to make as much benefit of light cover. They can basically ignore that for really quite a lot of their squads, needing to only really rely on things like dense cover or actual line of sight blocking terrain. With a lot of their good builds revolving around mass spamming of aggressive greater demons as well, they can be kind of vulnerable to things like Assassinate or Abhor the Witch. If you can deal with a fair amount of their heavy hitters, then you're going to rack up the points for those really quite quickly. Thousand Suns next, and these Sorcerer Space Marines are kind of middling in power in 40k right now. Perhaps one of the more balanced books that Games Workshop's released in 9th edition. Plenty of fun and powerful tricks throughout the codex, though not quite on the same power creep curve that a lot of the other factions have had. Naturally, with just about every single unit in their army being a Psyker. Again, that does tend to come with its downsides. Things like lots of Deny the Witch or armies that have great mortal wound defense will do quite well against them. And again, if the opponent can take it, Abhor the Witch is likely going to add up to a fair amount of free points. Their units are also kind of underwhelming without multiple buffs stacked on them. The Scarab Occult Terminators tend to be their main damage dealers, but just on their raw stats and shooting at melee, they're kind of okay, but not outstanding. To actually get really efficient, you do need to layer on a whole bunch of psychic buffs to make them more dangerous or tougher. It's kind of similar for mobility as well. Their automata are generally fairly durable and have obsec, but they will be moving very slowly around the board, and again they're going to be more reliant on tricks for mobility, things like double moving with psychic powers, teleporting around the board with duplicity, or using that dark matter crystal. Finally, they don't really have a crazy amount of ranged firepower on the go. I guess they can do okay things with Contemptor Dreadnoughts, and again layering loads of buffs on Scarab Terminators can make their shooting fairly scary. Though in general they're going to have to get within 24-inch ranges, and again they'll quite likely want to be closer with mortal wounds, something that can be a little bit difficult if they are moving around quite slowly. In terms of firepower, the main things that you're going to need to deal with are the Rubrics and the Scarabs. They're toughness 4 with decent saves, so you want guns with strength 5+, AP -2 or better, and generally going to be wanting multi-damage rather than damage 1, which they get their special increased save from all this dust. Things like massed overcharged plasma weapons are often going to give you a good time, or anything else with damage 2 and that kind of profile. Moving on to the Nurgle Marines, the Death Guard got some heavy nerfs in Chapter Approved. I'd say they're currently medium to weaker on the tree of factions. Increases to their Poxwalkers, Terminators, and a few other things just really weren't all that necessary in my opinion. They still certainly do have their strengths, with disgusting resilience giving them -1 damage, and in particular their Plague Burst Crawlers are ridiculously efficient for the points cost, though they do have a lot of weaknesses over their faction. They tend to be around about as slow as Thousand Suns, with less tricks to get them to move faster, and a lot of their units just don't really have all that great damage output. A lot of their standard bolter shooting is AP 0, and they'll need to get either Terminators in melee or use a bunch of mortal wound tricks to actually cause some efficient damage to the foe. Death Guard tend to want to try and play the war of attrition. I kind of feel that a few of their key datasheets just feel a bit underwhelming now after those nerfs. They certainly felt like an army that was functioning just fine before, and things like the Poxwalkers and Terminators didn't really need an increase. If fighting them, the main thing I'd avoid taking along is damage 2 weapons. Disgustingly resilience just going to make them kind of useless. You'd either want to be spamming damage 1, damage 3, or mortal wounds, and at least a reasonable amount of AP. Most things are going to be saving on a 3+ or 2+. Generally anti-tank weapons or high caliber anti-infantry guns are going to do okay. Finally, for the Forces of Chaos, we have the Chaos Knights, basically very similar to the Imperial Knights. I'd argue they're probably a little bit weaker of the two on balance, as they're kind of similar to the Imperial armies, but don't have any 9th edition supplements like House Raven or the Freeblade Lance to fall back on. They have basically the same kind of issues as the Imperial Knights if you're fielding them pure. Ridiculously elite for things like objectives and dealing with mass infantry, risks of big debuffs hitting super heavies, heavy anti-tanks wrecking them, and also not particularly getting on well with terrain. Also, their unique secondary objective that they got in Chapter Approved isn't quite as good as the Imperial Knight one, I think, which doesn't exactly help them much either. Xenos next, and the Craftworld Eldar have just had their codex regenerated. They certainly seem to be putting in some fairly solid performance at tournaments, with lots of fast and hard-hitting units and some good synergy with psychic powers. In general, Eldar units do tend to go fast and hit hard, though a lot of their models really are quite expensive. If you can counter-attack them or hit them before they get to Alpha Strike, they're generally going to fall down relatively easily, and if you can force them to trade out their units badly, then they're in for a bad time with their Toughness 3 infantry. If they're relying quite heavily on things like Aspect Warriors, they're really going to hate Mass Ignore's line of sight firepower. Things like a whole bunch of Tau Smart missiles and air-bursting fragmentation projectors are really going to give them a hard time, and within their force organisation chart, I'd argue that their troop section is a bit on the weak side. Units with generally lower damage dealing than their elites, but also not really significantly tougher either, being fragile space elves. Weapon selection maybe isn't the biggest issue. I think with Eldar you can afford not to have the highest damage weapons out there. If you can bring them to bear, they're usually going to be effective. Lots of damage 1 weapons for dealing with their infantry, and then most standard issue anti-tank weapons will do decent damage to their grav tanks, as they don't tend to be quite as hard to take down as other things. Maybe it's more important to have those weapons actually be able to reach their target on fast platforms, or to have Ignore's line of sight within the army. Both of those could be seriously annoying for the Eldar. In terms of missions and things, in general Craftworlds aren't really going to like tables with low amounts of line of sight blocking terrain. For the most part, they just really don't want to be engaged in a straight shooting fight against the opponents. They need to use their battle focus and tricksy things to jump in and out of terrain, and hopefully deal damage without getting shot themselves too much. The Harlequins seem to be the latest force taking the meta by storm. They seem ridiculously strong, have already got great tournament results, and certainly appear to be one of the top factions in the game at time of recording. If you are fielding a pure Harlequin army, then their unit pool will be a bit limited, though to be honest, in general that doesn't seem to be the biggest issue for them, as they are managing to make it work quite well. You can spam things like Voidweavers and Skyweavers really easily these days, and most of their cast of characters is well worth taking for the cost. Their troops and skimmers are really speedy, they're generally going to get where they need to go. In general, they'll do very well at trading out units against the smaller, lighter units in your force, though they might really struggle to take down really massive big Death Stars and things. If they can't soften them up with a whole bunch of Voidweaver or Shuriken fire first, individual troops definitely run the risk of just charging straight into them and then getting cut down. Their Harlequin troops do have a fair amount of barriers to damage, though they aren't enormously durable if you can catch them with a flurry of light infantry fire. When fighting Harlequins, generally fairly long range, high volume, low AP fire will do the best. Almost everything's got an invul, so you don't need high AP. You generally want long range or barrage weapons, because Shadow Seers are going to often increase the range on the units that you're targeting. And if you're trying to deal with their Void Weavers and Star Weavers, a lot of Strength 6 and 7 weapons will usually be quite effective. Things like autocannons are quite a good choice. I think Mortal Wounds are also worth a shout as well. They don't have all that much defense against them, and do quite a good job of bypassing the many defenses they have to firepower, such as the -1 to hits and invul saves and things. Definitely a very scary army at the moment. That's got a whole load of things going for it though. Next up we come to the Drukhari, a faction I'd describe as decently strong at the moment. Again, they've received multiple layers of nerfs since their ridiculously powerful codex came out last year, though I'd say their book at the moment is at least relatively well balanced, with multiple good units to draw from. Drukhari lists can often look really quite different, depending on whether they're going heavy on the Covens or the Cabals or the Witch Cults. In general though, a fair amount of their damage is either going to be coming from poison weapons or lance fire. Invul saves will definitely help against dart lances, and mass poison is a bit underwhelming against certain units. Things with low toughness in particular can kind of shrug it off. As a faction without psychers, they also don't really have very much psychic defense on offer, which could be an issue against some opponents. When trying to bring them down, in general large volumes of relatively low strength and low AP fire will do well. Autocannons and similar profiles will do excellently against things like Raiders and Ravagers, and mass damage 1 fire will do quite well against most infantry. It's often possible to pull some seriously powerful counter-attacks off once the Drukhari have struck. If you can get a unit to jump forward, shoot one unit to death and then charge another, then you could potentially take out a fair amount of very pricey models. They're often going to get the jump on you out of Raiders, but I think you often need just multiple lines of defense to weather the first storm, and then counter-attack powerfully and take out some more of the rest. Next up we come to the Tyranids. At current time of recording, we're in the weird situation where we've seen their entire book leaks, but we haven't actually had their codex officially drop yet. In general, I think they're looking like a book that's looking very strong indeed, but they're perhaps still in a stage where people are experimenting with them and trying to find out which units and combos work the best. Army-wise, they are quite a diverse faction with a whole load of niches covered, quality melee and ranged units, plenty of big monsters and small swarms, although I would say that their troop swarms are a little bit on the expensive side right now. Kind of interesting where they're in the position of having a very hoardy troop section where all of the troops cost 7 points or more per model, and aren't really all that durable for the cost, I'd say. If you are facing Tyranids, it does seem that killing the Synapse creatures as early as possible is perhaps more important than ever, as well as actually just deleting the units and making it a lot more of the Tyranid units susceptible to morale. It'll hurt them being able to do things like synaptic imperatives and things, which is quite a big deal. Their ignores line of sight options are really quite a lot weaker than before as well. I think the era of Hive Guard spam with Impaler cannons is finally at an end, though admittedly they have gained a whole bunch of interesting toys to make up for it. Weapons-wise, I'd be tempted to take on at least a fair amount of very high AP, high damage weapons to deal with all of those toughness 8 monsters with a 2+ armor save. They're the sort of things that just really aren't going to die without dedicated anti-tank fire. And on certain tables, I do feel that some of the bigger bugs might have slight maneuvering issues around terrain. Lots of their big creatures do have some fairly big bases, and they might struggle to fit through certain movement avenues. Still though, their new dex is looking really quite exciting. I'm very interested to see what people make of it. For the Servants of the Four-Armed Emperor, we have the Genestealer Cults. Currently an army I'd rank somewhere medium to strong. One of Games Workshop's few codexes where they've managed to release a fairly well-balanced one, rather than something that completely breaks the meta again. With Genestealer Cult units, a lot of the codex does just generally have fairly underwhelming profiles, both in terms of damage and defense, and unless they're making absolutely massive use of Alpha Strike abilities or their special rules like Crossfire, they're not going to hit quite as hard as a lot of their competitors. They also do need to make sure that they hit very hard on their first strike as well, as a lot of their units just really aren't all that hard to remove at all. Unless you can hide them after they've hit the enemy, they're quite often just going to get gunned straight down or assaulted and killed. They'll generally be making great use of their Cult Ambush rule to come in 8 inches and try and charge, or appear 6 inches away and try and shoot, but even with those boosted deep strike potentials, there is the chance for quite a few armies to zone them out of huge sections of the board, particularly if you're facing a very hoardy type army that's got lots of chaff units. The Genestealers really are going to be quite annoyed if they're not able to drop anywhere near the opponent's backfield objectives and things. Also, anything that can zone out deep strike is going to be nasty, things like Space Marine infiltrators, or intercept things like Auspex scan, that can be kind of horrible against certain units, and again could be a way of flipping it round so the enemy gets to strike you rather than you strike the enemy. Weapons wise, as I was mentioning, a lot of the codex just isn't really all that tough once it's exposed. A lot of their most vicious units only have 1 wound, so mass anti-infantry 5 is generally going to do great work against virtually all targets. It can even lend a hand against bigger tougher things like aberrants or trucks, as of course damage 1 doesn't care about the -1 damage that they get. Next up we come to the Tau Empire, another one of the big threats of the 41st millennium, and one of the strongest armies in the game at the moment. They've got a lot of very strong options, really big firepower, and can often lay it down after moving significant distances as well, and are quite likely to outshoot the vast majority of factions in the game at the moment. Of course, Tau famously have a fair few limitations. They've got little to no anti-psyker, very little melee capability outside of a few things like Crute and specific commander builds, and their low ballistic skill can actually be really quite a big issue as well. A lot of their codex hits on 4s, so if you can kill marker lights, keep your units in dense cover, or take units along that have -1 to hit, you could really blunt quite a lot of their firepower. They're one of the few armies that you can really afford to have multiple sources of -1 to hit on one unit, as you might be cancelling out the marker light and then also make them hit on 5s as well. Otherwise, perhaps one of their biggest issues is struggling to hold down the midfield somewhat. Most of their units just aren't really enormously tough for the points cost, so there's not really a whole ton of stuff you just want to throw in the midfield and have the entire enemy's army firing at. Breaches in Devilfish or Crute can do some work, but they still should be at least relatively easy to take down with their defensive profiles. If you can weather the storm enough to hold on to the midfield for a fair bit of the game, then the Tau could be in trouble even if they do eventually win the shooting fight. In terms of weapons to bring along if you're expecting to fight a lot of Tau, I'd typically be looking at strength 6 or more multi-damage weapons. Some of the biggest things to fear for the Tau at the moment are crisis suits and broadsides, toughness 5 units with a bunch of wounds that you usually want to be wounding on 3s. Even then though it can be a bit annoying, you'll often have to slog through multiple drones before actually getting to the suits, but being able to whittle down a crisis blob to nothing is going to be a really big deal. Next up we have the Orks, another army that are rated somewhere on the medium to strong side at the moment. Not exactly top tier anymore though, as they were toned down quite painfully from their codex, with a couple of limitations on their spam, and also a few hefty points increases. With Orks they really can play quite differently depending on whether they're going for melee power surging across the board, or if they're going for a speed wire list with a whole bunch of shooty planes and buggies and things, and reacting to both of those will be quite different. Perhaps one of the main weaknesses for Orks in the new codex is their morale abilities. A lot of their units are only leadership 7, some of them are even less, and it does mean that by inflicting a bunch of chip casualties on a lot of units, you could increase your damage quite a lot by getting more morale runaways. Even in 3 to 5 model units it can be a big issue for Ork players. For shooting Orks generally hit on 5s, and even with freebooters that's only going to be hitting on 4s, so any use of dense cover or -1 to hit units is really going to give them a bad time. You're either going to be reducing their damage output by a third or a half. For melee Orks, their main issue is delivering the units into combat. The wire can give them a good initial boost to get there, but it does only last for a couple of turns. It might mean that Ork lists have a bit of an initial surge at the start, and then run out of momentum a little bit later in the game. For fighting Orks, I typically want a fair amount of strength 8 or more weapons, mainly to get around their ramshackle rule that makes their vehicles annoying to take out. If you shoot them with strength 7 or less, then they have -1 damage, which really ruins the efficiency of things like autocannons, or things like quite a lot of fancy melee units with mid-strength and damage 2. Otherwise a fair amount of damage 1 can still be good, that will still have decent effect against fairly flimsy ramshackle vehicles, and also can be nice for picking up toughness 5 boys and things, storm boys, commandos, or Ork mobs. Finally we get on to Necrons, an army that's been seeing a bit of a resurgence lately with its chapter approved points drops and some very powerful melee units in Scorpet destroyers, wraiths and flayed ones. Generally Necrons tend to be at least fairly tough, and now with their stronger combos can deal some fairly decent melee damage, though still for quite a lot of units actually getting them there could be an issue. A lot of the codex does tend to be at least fairly slow when it's on the board. When attacking them, I'd often bear in mind reanimation protocols. If it is possible to cleanly wipe out entire units in one massive round of shooting, that's going to be preferable as it could be a way of getting around them altogether. And also I'd be a little bit wary of dealing chip damage to them just in case they reanimate models in a really unhelpful place, either getting them closer to you, closer to objectives, or in cover or things, which could be quite frustrating. They also don't have a lot of options for anti-psychic powers as well, so psyker armies might well have a bit of a field day hitting them with all their nastiest spells. For trying to kill Necrons, generally I'd say that strength 6 or 7 weapons are a fairly sweet spot for them. A lot of their best units like Immortals, Scorpet Destroyers, Wraiths, and even things like their Ghost Arcs or Doomsday Arcs will generally get wounded on 3s or 4s by these, and damage 2 weapons can be fairly effective as well, as there's not a lot of -1 damage in the Necron Codex. Generally with Necrons you mainly just want to focus down one entire unit at once and hopefully stop it getting back up either via reanimation protocols or resurrection orbs, or even just healing with living metal. So I think that just about brings us to the end of our run through every army's weaknesses in Warhammer 40k. As I said, this is a bit of a broad brush overview. If there's anything else that you think that I've missed, please let me know down in the comments. Any fun counters or particular tactical weaknesses of certain armies are really appreciated. I'm sure we'll all be able to learn a bit about each other's insights from our own factions. Let me know your biggest frustrations with your own army and things that you really don't want your opponent to capitalise on in-game down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and it is what allows me to keep on making so many videos like this quite so regularly. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.